I'm going to begin with a story. It's not my story. It's the story of a gentleman called Thomas Warwick, and you may have heard of it. He was with the State Department, US State Department, in the years leading up to the invasion of Iraq. And in 2002, he was tasked with the responsibility of preparing for the contingency of possibly invading Iraq, and in particular the responsibility of taking care of the post-conflict state building. So he put together the Future of Iraq project, and that was bringing together experts who understood the region, experts in civilian bureaucratic management, Iraqi exiles and others. And for a number of months he worked on this Future of Iraq project, and by the end of it, it was a 2,500 page report that had different divisions focused on every sector in Iraq, what needs to happen with regards to democracy, oil sector, agriculture, and so forth. And then in January 2003, if you recall, the invasion was in March 2003, January 2003, the Bush administration decides to take away the post-conflict reconstruction part away from the State Department and give it to the Defense Department. And thereafter, all of the effort of the Future Iraq project was discarded. It wasn't consulted. It just lay there. It sat there on the side. And the reason I tell you the story, because it has nothing to do with religion, but the reason I tell you the story is that sometimes, as many of you know who have been involved in government or diplomacy or any other sector, that sometimes the information is there, the knowledge is there, but for whatever reason, it's not necessarily drawn upon. And I think this is the situation with religion and post-conflict state building. If you take a look at some of these statistics now that I'm going to go through, 91% of people in fragile and failed states see religion as being important in their lives. 80% of people in fragile and failed states have confidence in religious institutions, compared to 48% in government. 70% of people in Afghanistan said religious leaders should be consulted on political matters. 95% of people in Egypt said they had confidence in Al-Azhar University. 60% in Bosnia and Herzegovina said they had trust in religious institutions. And have a look at this, the highlighted words there: confidence, trust, importance, political matters. This is how a lot of people in the rest of the world see religion. Now let me tell you another story, but this one's a personal story. In 2003, I was in Iraq, and I was in the holy city of Najaf, the capital for the Shia Islam religious leaders, where there were a lot of ayatollahs. Their seminaries are based there. And at that moment, this was late 2003, the Coalition Provisional Authority had decided to allocate ambassadors or representatives of the central CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority, to the governorates, to the provincial regions. And so the one who was designated to go to Najaf was a gentleman called Ambassador Robert Ford, and I had the opportunity to meet with him. And so I asked him, will you be engaging with religious leaders? And his answer to me was no. And why? Because his intent was, and the American authorities' attempt was, to reinforce a secular central authority in Baghdad. They wanted to reconstitute a secular government that had nothing to do with religious leaders. Now, I thought that was a little bit naive, but then again, I was a young guy at the time running an NGO in the field, so what would I know? But the thought that came to mind then was, why would the representative of the occupying forces in the capital of Shia Islam, Shia Islamic scholarship and leadership, have refused to engage with the Ayatollahs? Was it ignorance? Was it strategic? Or was it fear? And so this question got me thinking, and that's how I came to researching for this book and for my PhD. When I started to look at the role of religion in post-conflict state building in countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor, or South Sudan, there was very little work done on the role of religion. And instead, academics would usually associate any religious institution with civil society institutions. So to them, the Roman Catholic Church was no different to the YMCA, or an Islamic institution or a mosque was no different to some other NGO, Oxfam, for example. They seemed in academia to serve the same purpose and act in the same way. And I thought this was not probably correct, and so I started to look into it. And it became apparent to me that there's two important questions that need to be asked. The first one is, what is unique about religious institutions in post-conflict state building? And in particular, how is it that they can contribute to the reconstruction process or the state building process? And the second question, the more important question, and the one that took me quite a while to wrap my head around, was why would religious institutions contribute their resources to what is largely a secular state building process? And this isn't an obvious question, nor is it an obvious answer, but I'll get onto that in a minute. The first question, so to respond to the first question, how can religious institutions contribute to state building? First of all, I need to just clarify what is state building. There's a lot of confusion out there, especially because of the Americans. They tend to refer always to nation states. You may hear Americans talking about the nation state of Iraq or nation building of Iraq, that they're involved in nation building in Afghanistan. And this is problematic and it's confusing. So I just want to clarify this. A state is a particular geographic area bounded by a border. A nation is a group of people who have a common heritage, history, culture, religion, or language. Not all nations are states, and not all states are nations. So you have like the Kurds, who are a nation of people, but who live across 4 or 5 different states. And you have states who are not nations necessarily. So in particular countries that were established after the colonial era ended, where borders were drawn across nations of people. And so you will have a state that had multiple nations of people within it. And so the state building process that I'm talking about is related to that bounded area within a border. It is looking at the institutional aspects of the state, the functional aspects of a state, not the nation building that occurs over generations and centuries. And so this is why it's a little bit confusing sometimes when the Americans talk about nation building in Iraq when they're really state building. So looking at how religion can contribute to state building, it's a pretty straightforward question in academia. It's about taking what religion is and looking at what successful state building requires and trying to marry the two. So in a quick review of this, the literature or experience, even from policymakers, suggests that there are 3 critical components for successful state building. So if you're involved in the future of rebuilding Yemen or Syria, remember these 3 things. It's legitimacy. You need to have the authority coming into power to come in a way that is perceived to be legitimate. The second one is public security, ensuring that security is provided immediately. That is an important critical aspect, and the provision of basic needs. There are other aspects, economic development, democracy, broader development aspects that are important, but they're not critical. These 3 things are considered critical. And so for me, it was a matter of bringing those 2 things together, the religion and the 3 critical elements. So, for example, with provision of basic needs, I think that's pretty straightforward. You've got religious institutions like the Roman Catholic Church who have Caritas. Caritas is an arm of the Catholic Church that provides humanitarian assistance. Islamic institutions exist throughout the world that provide humanitarian assistance, and then they've got the process of zakat that collects incomes that are redistributed. It's effectively a welfare system. So I'm not going to touch on that, that's straightforward. With regards to legitimacy, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail when we come to Syria, so I'll put that aside. and just talk about security. Now, you may recall that it was Stalin who said, "How many divisions has the Pope?" And the point with that question was that what value does religion contribute to security or power? In effect, Stalin was laughing at the Catholic Church, saying it has no military might and so therefore it doesn't have any influence. But that's actually not the case. It's true that it doesn't have soldiers and policemen, but it does have an ability to contribute to security. Now, in 2007, the OECD did a survey and it came out that 80% of the people in today's fragile states rely upon non-state actors for their security. So these non-state actors can be tribal leaders, they can be other groups, community militias and etc., but they can also be religious leaders. And the problem in general from the Western state building perspective is that we don't acknowledge that. We don't acknowledge that 80% of people in failed states or fragile states rely on non-state actors. And so what we tend to do is send in police force or the military, which is good for peacekeeping perspectives, but it's not good for security, because a policeman who's from Australia doesn't necessarily understand the local language, local culture and the norms and the political machinations that occur at the local level. And this is why the non-state actors are so important for security. And one of them, like I mentioned, is religion or religious institutions. Somalia is the most important or well-known of the countries where religious institutions establish security. The Union of Islamic Courts in the late 90s, early 2000s arose from a need in Somalia because it was a failed state for stability. They arose because businessmen needed the authority that Islam can afford to arbitrate on business disputes. And from that it grew into what became a government effectively. It controlled Somalia. It provided security in Somalia until the alternative government was supported by Ethiopian and other forces I can't recall at the moment, and basically they were eliminated from their position of authority. Other places in the world where religion contributes to security is, for example, Afghanistan. In a survey there from 2011, 25% of people surveyed indicated that in cases of land dispute, the first person they would go to is an imam. In Yemen, the cultural context of Yemen is such that when there are disputes between tribes, they go to a family that is from the house of God or house of Allah, and they are the ones who arbitrate between disputes between tribes. So arbitration and mediation is an important responsibility that religious leaders have with regards to security, but not the only one. There are two others. Building social capital strengthens the ties that bind society together and builds trust between groups. Research suggests that social capital can explain 10% of variation in crime rates. Now that may not sound like a lot, but actually academia, scholarship only can identify the determinants of about half of the determinants of crime. So 10% is a substantial figure there. And religion can play a very large role in building social capital. The other mechanism for increasing security is socializing civic values. That is spreading the values and norms that support civic behavior. So in some countries, the ratio of imams and priests to the population is as high as several hundred people per cleric. And this is a very personalized engagement that occurs in society. And if it's the right message that's being conveyed by the right trusted authority, it's a really important mechanism through which civic values can be conveyed. In other countries, religious publications are some of the most widely read. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, religious publications have a penetration rate of 25%. That means 1 in 4 households have access to a religious publication that they purchase or get one way or another. Not only Muslim, but Christian also. So That's a considerable readership of religious publications that, again, would exist for a reason, and if they exist, we have to understand how they influence the spreading of civic values. So that's how religious institutions can contribute to public security. So this is what I've just been talking about, how they can contribute to state building. And you can see it's all very small there, but basically what I've just gone through are the three primary elements: legitimacy, public security, and basic needs. And I've just talked about this one, security. Up here is legitimacy, here is basic needs. But the next question is, as far as religion is concerned, is why? Why would they contribute their substantial resources to what is largely a secular state building process? And when we talk about substantial resources, let me just make a point of this. The Catholic Church has 17,000 primary health care clinics around the world. 5,000 hospitals. That's the same number of hospitals that there are in the United States. Its budget, just in the United States, annual budget is $170 billion. Same as the global revenue of the largest of multinationals. In many Muslim countries, the entire social security system is dependent upon Islamic institutions or processes. So these are incredible resources. You saw the trust levels that I put up before. You see the material resources that they have, and yet we ignore them. We go into these foreign countries in Iraq and Afghanistan and we ignore religious leaders and institutions. And so the question then that I was trying to tackle, and the much harder question that I found while I was doing my PhD and writing this book, was the question of why. Why would religious institutions contribute these resources? And I think it's a little bit presumptuous to assume that the largely Western devised, led and funded international system should have goals that align with all of the major religions of the world. It's not just Islam or Christianity we're talking about, but Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism, and so forth. I thought it was a little bit presumptuous to make that assumption. It makes sense to presume that the Western system, ranging from the concept of human rights through to ideas of the preeminence of the individual and the global structure of states, align with Christianity as they evolved from events in Western Europe. The emphasis upon the individual stems in part from the Christian idea of individual salvation. The global structure of states stems from the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the war between Protestants and Catholics. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed at the UN in 1948, unanimously, but at the time there were only 48 states. Now we have 193 states. And as a result of that diffusion, you're getting all of these alternative human rights statements that have been put out, including the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, as well as the Bangkok Declaration that covers Asian states. So I think that the answer is that it is clearly presumptuous of us to assume that our efforts, our state building efforts, would align with all religions. So the question then is, if I may just add, I mean, we just have to look at what's happening in Syria and Iraq today with Islamic State. Clearly, their idea of what a state should be doesn't align with what our idea is. They've excluded democracy and certainly equality from the basis of the foundation of the state that they are trying to establish. So where do we begin then in trying to understand where the state building, Western state building endeavour overlaps with the goals of different religions? For this, we need to consider what motivates religions. In other words, their telos. Telos is a Greek word for goal. In academia, scholars modelled the actions of religious groups by drawing upon the secular framing of rational choice theory or resource dependency theory. So, for example, what they suggest is that religious institutions act like any other institution in that they try to either maximize membership, attain tax concessions, increase assets, or any other making them inadequate to fully integrate the impetus for religious institutions. Because you have to keep in mind that the people who are allocating the resources of a religious institution are ingrained in this paradigm. It's not a matter of us deciding, it's a matter of the clerics themselves who are ingrained in this paradigm or this worldview. So acknowledging, as it is only in Christ that man can attain salvation, then the church must be considered differently than other civil society actors, as it offers tangible outcomes that no other secular institution can. Acknowledging this view, one where salvation is real, establishes a theoretical basis from which we can begin to reflect upon the Catholic Church's theological interest in state building. So if you think back to the Balkans War of the 1990s, and I'll give you a moment now to cast your mind back, there was a lot of criticism of the Catholic Church for spending limited resources on rebuilding churches rather than distributing humanitarian supplies. There were some even who accused the Church of rebuilding churches for the purposes of furthering ethnic territorial claims. But see, to me, if you truly believe in salvation and the power of grace, then for the Church to offer the sacrament of Holy Communion, which is the sacrament of sacraments, a consecrated place is required, and according to canon law, this can only under exceptional circumstances is such a place not a consecrated church. Within this worldview, all of a sudden the Church's allocation of resources to rebuilding the churches makes sense. Now, I'm not saying that every decision by every religious leader is based on theology. There are religious leaders who make political decisions. There are those who think that they're making decisions based on theology, but it's influenced by religion. There are corrupt religious leaders who make decisions solely on their own self-interest. All of that exists, but if we're going to be modeling how religious leaders allocate their resources, you've got to begin with at least the foundation of their doctrinal views. So when looking at the three primary order elements of successful state building, that's legitimacy, security, and basic needs, in my book, I go through how the Catholic Church's priorities could reinforce or contribute to each individual aspect. As for Islam, we can't borrow the same telos or goal, as there is no suggestion in their scriptures, the Quran or Hadith, that Allah wants all or even most people to enter paradise. Quite on the contrary, in some passages it becomes evident that Allah foresees a majority not entering paradise. Other than the 10 companions, prophets, martyrs, and children, there is no expressed view on who or how many Allah wants saved. There was even a sect who believed that all of mankind, once they passed into hell and paradise, that Allah would destroy both places and all their inhabitants and remain alone as he had before he created the universe. As such, we are left with knowing that there is a purpose. Not for idle sport did we create the heavens and the earth and all that is between. This is from the Quran. But not knowing whether the purpose of the heavens and the earth is nothing more than idle sport for some humans or full of purpose for all humans. So if not individual salvation, then what could be the overarching telos of Islam, overarching goal of Islam? Belief in one God and justice are two of the predominant recurring themes within Islam. Because of the secular nature of state building, belief is unlikely to yield many mutual interests, and so I run with justice. Islam, unlike Christianity, has far more to say about how society should be structured. For example, while the dominant theme in Christianity on this matter is either of then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God, or let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So these are the two quotes that most academics would borrow from when they look at Christian political theology. In Islam, there's considerable guidance on marriage, criminal law, inheritance law, laws of war, taxation, and so forth. Abiding by this divine gift of knowledge of how to shape society is how some Muslim communities define justice. This connection between religion, society and politics is reflected in the many political parties in Muslim countries having justice in their name. There's the Freedom Justice Party in Egypt, Justice and Development Party in Turkey, Prosperous Justice Party in Indonesia, Pakistan Movement for Justice in Pakistan, and so forth. You'll see justice in every name in political parties in every Muslim country. For some political parties and religious groups, when the state is guided by Islam, it can be a powerful tool in this regard as it controls significant levers of authority through which it can contribute to transformative justice. Okay, that's a lot smaller than I anticipated. But this is a Pew Institute, I think it's called, Research Center, Pew Research Center survey, where they looked at how much political influence should religious leaders have throughout those regions. Now, most of them are Muslim countries, but we have some Christian countries, primarily Russia at the top there. And as you can see, large influence is the one in green. And some countries go up to 41%, 53%, 37%, who think that religious leaders should have large influence in political matters. But not all state-building efforts will contribute towards an Islamic social structure. In some cases, such as in states with minority Muslim populations or secular state-building efforts, a non-Islamic authority is likely to emerge. So this then becomes a lot more complicated than what I've just explained, and I'm not going to delve into all the further layers of Islamic theology for this. If you're interested, more than welcome to pick up a copy of my book afterwards. I'm happy to sell you a copy. But I'll leave it at that for this level. So next, what I'd like to talk about is Syria. So this is the direction that my research is going on at the moment. Is I'm hoping to take this model that I've developed and then apply it to Syria. So eventually, whether it's 1 year or 5 years or more, there will be some semblance of peace and there will be efforts at reconstruction. And so I want to start looking at, well, what are the theologies of the different religious groups? How do they align with state building, with the primary elements of state building? What capacity do they have to contribute to state building efforts? So that's the direction that I'm going in now. And so I'm just going to talk about very first thoughts, early thoughts on this. So first of all, what do we know about religion and its standing in Syria? Here are a few points. Gallup poll in 2012 on whether Sharia should be the sole source of legislation in Syria, 15 to 20% yes. So the important word here is sole source. While 30 to 40% said it should be just one of the building blocks underpinning legislation. Now, that's not as high as other results. In Yemen, as you can see, 68% for men and 58% of women said it should be the sole source of legislation. The second point, prior to the uprising and subsequent civil war, the most visited Syrian website was that of an Islamic scholar. And in 2010, 3 of the top 5 best-selling books in Syria were written by Islamic scholars. So what this tells me is that religion will play an active role in the new Syria, regardless of who wins. But it's not clear yet to me about what role it will play. So where I'm at the moment is thinking, well, will it be able to contribute to the basic needs of people? So the question is, do the religious structures of Islam in Syria, are they capable, are they structured in such a way that they will be at the forefront of providing the basic needs for people? And the answer is largely no. In Syria, religious institutions are very localized. There's no overarching body, there's no institutional structure, and I'm talking about Sunni Islam here, through which large amounts of international assistance can be provided. So Syria doesn't have an established Muslim Brotherhood that's, for example, was so well established in Egypt, or it doesn't have something like the Islamska Zajednica, which is the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is an institutionalized Islamic structure that not only provides fatwas but also humanitarian assistance and so forth. So I suspect that when it comes to basic needs in Syria, it will probably coming through organizations like Red Crescent or Islamic Aid, so more secular styled NGOs that have a religious or potentially more associated with an Islamic community. And the next one is, well, possibly as a mechanism for the provision of public security. And to me, that's a depends, a maybe. As far as adjudicating and mediating disputes, well, if Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra win and they end up dominating Syria, then certainly there will be Sharia courts and other aspects of Islamic jurisprudence will be included in legislation. But if more moderate groups or Bashar al-Assad take control, then I doubt it. So that's, it depends who there. But with the other aspects of public security, when I was referring to social capital and civic values, I think religious institutions will be very important in Syria in the post-conflict reconstruction period, especially when you're looking at these figures. There's a high level of trust, institutions are localized, there's a real penetration of the media and publications. So it would be a very important partner for international communities were they to be engaged in Syria to look at this with regards to helping to establish security. But the last aspect, the one that I didn't touch on early on, was legitimacy. And I think this is the one that's going to be most important in Syria. A lot of research has been undertaken on how state legitimacy is established. And one of the leading academics in this is a gentleman called David Beetham. And he came up with 3 intertwined aspects. So for a state to have legitimacy, it needs legal validity. So somehow, according to some legal mechanism, it acquired authority. It has to have the justification for being there, and there has to be some sort of expressions of consent. It doesn't necessarily need to be democracy. It can be, in Islam or former Arab culture, bay'at, which is like a pledge of allegiance, or it can be other mechanisms. So you have to have those 3 for a legitimate authority. When you have religious institutions that are widely trusted, with deep roots in society, and mechanisms through which they can convey expressions of a consent on behalf of believers, then it can become a powerful legitimizing force. If the Islamic extremists end up dominating in Syria, then you can expect and embrace a religion for this purpose, for the legitimizing purpose. So you would expect to see religion in what would equate to a constitution, on their flag, names of the party or the government, education curriculum. All of this would be used to legitimize the authority, the new authority. But my book wasn't written really to help them. My book was written hopefully that others would be reading it, the Western or international community would be reading it. And so from that perspective, if the international community is involved in the post-conflict state building in Syria, I think religion can play an important role in legitimizing the new power structure in a way that hasn't been done before. So what I would recommend, just 3 brief points early on in my study, so this could change in the future, is, for example, inviting religious leaders whose theology aligns with concepts common to the international community for early consultation. This wasn't done by the Americans in Iraq. Quite the opposite, they excluded Ayatollah Sistani, which was a huge mistake. But this requires a deep understanding of theology, which is again a problem because it's very unlikely that policy and decision makers would be so free and comfortable to engage with theologians. But I think that's one recommendation. Documenting the legitimacy of the ascension to power within the Islamic context of Syria, possibly through a committee of scholars who would rule on its legality. So, Islam is a jurisprudential religion. There are laws. There's a large body of law related to the correct mechanism to ascension of authority. And so it's possible for Islamic scholars to review this and to say whether the means by which the international community came to power was by Islamic jurisprudence legal or not. And this is important. So if it is legal, then that should be made known. And the last one is, of course, this should be in the preamble to a new constitution and acknowledgement of the religious communities. So I'm just going to finish off now with one point, and that's the other one, and that's about Islamic State. I've been making quite some commentary in the media and the press about Islamic State and what's going on there. And some people may be wondering, well, a lot of what's happening is related to the military. And I'm neither a military man, nor do I pretend to be one. But my argument is that what's happening with Islamic State is not about their military successes. It's not that much about Iraqi's military failure. What it's about, at the core of what's happening now, is their success in state building. Islamic State has done a tremendous job in actually establishing a state. And for us to defeat Islamic State, we need to understand what their weaknesses are in establishing that state and how to undermine that state building process. Because they're not going, it's an ideology, it's a movement. They're not going to be militarily defeated. It's going to come about through the defeat of their state building endeavor. So to wrap up, I believe that we need to better understand religion and the cosmology of religions, especially for communities in which it plays an important role in their lives. Otherwise, we are simply fooling ourselves by presuming that our goals are universal goals. Otherwise, we are in effect trying to recreate them in our image, which funnily enough is a Christian concept, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.